Every video I make seems to take up at least 2 parts. And I'm going to try to make sure this one ends in part 2. I know you don't want to see another one. But wait, this is for people in the future. I keep forgetting who I'm making this for. And you might have all the time in the world for all I know. But I'm still going to limit this to a part 1 and part 2. So as far as I think, by the way, about injustice, that's a serious problem. I realize that a lot of Christians, it's very frightening to think that Christianity may have maintained for 2,000 years a very serious injustice against Jews, blaming them for the death of Jesus. When in fact, Jewish leaders, when I say when in fact because a large pattern of evidence in the gospel supports this, that Jewish leaders tried to save Jesus from a Roman execution. And Judas played his part in being a loyal friend to Jesus to the end. And if that turns out to be true, if I'm right about that, and I'm very right about that, the evidence supports that, then the opposite, that Jewish leaders conspired with Rome to kill him, is a terrible injustice and calumny against ancient Judaism and ancient Jewish leaders. And I think Christians are afraid of having those guilt feelings that we've maintained such a serious injustice for so long. But as I said, it's not an injustice committed by Christianity as a whole. God knows there have been many Christians over the centuries who've tried to challenge some of this. And they're Christians too, and they're a part of Christian tradition. So you can't blame Christianity as a whole. You have to look at individual theologians, individual so-called historical scholars who maintain this belief. The fault lies with them, not with Christianity as a whole, and Christians as a whole don't have anything to feel guilty about. And the other thing too is that if what I'm saying is true about how Jewish leaders and Judas tried to help Jesus at the end, how long do you want to put off the discovery of that and finally maintaining on a solid evidentiary basis that that's what happened? Because if we continue to ignore that and ignore the evidence, then we're involved in a cover-up, right? And as politics often shows us, the cover-up is often worse than the original crime. So the choices here are finally to get to the truth or continue to maintain a cover-up. And it's that cover-up that continues to be a serious problem. And that cover-up can be resolved if we just face it. And if you face it, then there's nothing to feel guilty about. That got to be a little longer than I wanted it to be. All right, I'm going to get to the subject of Jews now. I'm Jewish, so I know something about this. Jews have a lot of fears about this, more fears than any other group. And the reason is because their relationship to this history is more complicated. Look, Jesus was Jewish in the first place, a rabbi. So Jews have that relationship to it. A new religion, whether he intended it or not, and he probably didn't intend it, a new religion evolved from the story of Jesus, Christianity. And Christianity has a long and complicated history with Jews, a lot of it persecutory. And that's a very uncomfortable and fearful subject for a lot of people, especially Jews. So because of their complicated relationship to Christianity and their complicated relationship to first century Jewish history and the Jewish Jesus, there are a lot of fears here for Jews. One of the big ones that always comes up is the fear of conversion. Jews fear, and rightly so to some degree, that if we start getting into the historical Jewish Jesus, start getting to the subject in this history, then sooner or later somebody's going to try to use this to convert Jews to Christianity. And that has happened in the past. Now, I don't think this fear is as big a problem as it once was, because in fact it's a fear that is openly acknowledged by Jews. Jews talk about this fear. And whenever a fear is consciously acknowledged and talked about, it's much less serious of a problem. The real serious fears are the fears that nobody is willing to admit exist, the fears nobody wants to talk about. That's the fears that get in the way of a real scholarly study. And there's so much of it here, I actually had to make a list of it to remind myself, so I wouldn't forget these things. Look, another fear that Jews have here, and this is one of the fears Jews don't want to talk about, is they're afraid if they get into the subject of the historical Jewish Jesus, and they start talking about what makes Jesus so Jewish, that this is going to frighten Christians. And if Christians get frightened, it's going to stir up more anti-Semitism. So Jews have a big fear that any really good, sound discussion of the historical Jewish Jesus is going to stir up more anti-Semitism. I don't know if that's true or not. I have no idea, but Jews are afraid of that. They're also afraid, once you get into the subject and you start distinguishing between Jewish ideas, what makes Jesus so Jewish, and you start talking about Christian ideas that evolved later, Jews are afraid they're going to discover that there's a certain amount of Christianity they've internalized, that they're to a degree, and this is a broad way, a problem. It's a problem for any minority group, minority groups have a fear, and it's a kind of a legitimate fear, that they've internalized a certain amount of the majority culture. And Jews are like that too. They're afraid of discovering they're not as Jewish as they thought, that they have internalized a fair amount of Christian beliefs. Not only beliefs about Jesus and how he died, but beliefs about religion and what religion should be, and whether Jews should be proud of their past or ashamed of their past. They're afraid they've absorbed Christian ideas. So that's another fear they have, another reason they don't want to get into the subject. They're also afraid of discovering that if they get into this, they're going to discover how much anti-Semitism or how much prejudice there is about Judaism that still exists in the Christian world. And knowing that in the mainstream world there is a lot of prejudice about your group and about your history and your culture gives you a very sickening feeling in the pit of your stomach. And it's that sickening feeling right deep down in the pit of your stomach that Jews are afraid to feel. They don't want to feel it. They don't want to acknowledge it. They want to stay as far from it as possible. And that means staying far from any subject, any deep subject concerning Christianity. Oh, general abstractions will be entertained, but getting into the deep nitty-gritty of Jesus and his Jewishness may bring up just how many prejudices Christians still entertain about this, and that's going to make Jews feel sick in the pit of their stomach, which they don't want to feel. That's another fear. Another very legitimate fear that Jews have is that if they get into this at all, if they start to read about the historical Jewish Jesus, they're going to find a lot of negative description of ancient Judaism. And that, by the way, is true. I don't think there is a single book by a Christian scholar on historical Jesus, and I've said this in my work. There's not a single book by a Christian historical Jesus scholar from which you will walk away with a positive impression of ancient Judaism. They all leave you with a feeling that ancient Judaism was ritualistic, tribalistic, revolved around the temple and sacrifices. They had very primitive religious ideas. And Jesus was far, far superior to all this. If he was a Jew, he was a superior Jew, superior to any of the Jews of his time. And you're going to, if you're a Jew, you're going to walk away from these books feeling, oh my God, there's really nothing proud of us. There's nothing for us to be proud of in this history. When Jews look at history, they'll look further back, by the way, than the first century. Jews will study about the Maccabees and ancient, or the time, or Hebrew scriptures in the time of Moses. They'll glean positive things you can get out of Hebrew scripture, or even up to the Maccabees and the great nationalist feat that the Maccabees accomplished. Jews are willing to look at medieval Judaism and the history there. There's a lot of parts of historical Judaism that Jews are generally familiar with or are willing to study a bit. They just skip over the first century. That's like a no-no for most Jews, even for many Jewish scholars. Not all Jewish scholars. There are Jewish scholars who do study this. But in general, for Jews, they skip over the first century. We don't want to know about it. We don't want to get involved. We're kind of Christianity kind of owns Jewish history of the first century. Even Jewish scholars who study this have to get involved to some extent in what has been studied here. So another fear that Jews have is they're afraid they're going to read all this negative stuff about first century Judaism. And they're right, they are going to encounter this. I'm here to tell you, but wait, I realize I'm speaking to people in the future who already know this. So congratulations, you people in the future. You probably already know that this description of ancient Judaism as being primarily about temples, rituals, purity concerns, that all this is a very false description of first century Judaism. First century Judaism, as you will have learned hundreds of years from now, from my time, and this is, I presume, the time at which people are seeing this video hundreds of years from now, you will have learned by then that ancient Judaism, first century Judaism, was about constitutionalism. It was about the fight for Torah as constitution, to be governed, to have a constitutional form of government and not an autocratic form of government. It was a fight for constitution. It was a fight for liberties that follow from this. It was a fight for justice and peace. It was not about temple rituals and purity. It was about the fight for constitution and justice and peace. These were the things that were important to first century Jews, and that was important to Rabbi Joshua of Nazareth, by the way. But since nobody writes about first century Judaism like that, most Jews feel, they don't realize that you could discover that because nobody actually writes about that. Since you people in the future are perhaps enjoying this, and my little get up here, I'm going to finish this up in part 3, just so I don't have to feel rushed, if you know what I mean.